So welcome back to the third and final part of today's lecture. This is going to be a very brief run through some of the key ideas that I think should be emerging through the reading for you, and then we'll finish with a quick recap of the task for this week. So I've asked you to look at the Phillips chapter and the LeCocq article, and really, I mean, they resonate very clearly with what I've said in the lecture, and clearly the lecture builds on some of Phillips' ideas, but as a way of just recapping and drawing some conclusions from today's reading and the lecture, I'm just going to identify 8 themes that I think should be emerging from this as clear principles or conclusions for you. The first one is that both authors are arguing that you need to incorporate the use of evidence in your planning so that it's integrated into inquiries and so that you can plan for progression over time. And Heidi LeCocq, in her role as a head of department, is very clear here, and you can see how she's phasing in the different levels of analysis and ramping up the level of demand over the course of an entire year with children, and obviously she'll then have plans for how she can build on that in subsequent years. So it's really important that we plan this consciously in order to develop it, and also really important that we integrate it with the topics so that we don't hive off source work as a separate kind of activity. And the next few principles are really related to that, because it's important not to give the impression or fall into the trap of thinking that source work is a skill. Sometimes it's examined in this way, but all of the authors that I've been referring to today are adamant that really source work, the use of evidence in history, isn't just a skill, because it is rooted in a conceptual understanding of how historians work with evidence. It's rooted in an understanding of what evidence is and how it relates to the construction of knowledge in history. So there's some really difficult conceptual understanding going on in order to use sources well. And the second reason it's not just a skill is because to use a source, to critique it, to analyse it, to infer from it, to give it some kind of meaning in your own interpretation, requires you to draw on an increasingly sophisticated contextual knowledge. So one of the ways in which we judge a source is against the knowledge we have of the period or of the events and people that we already know something about, and so we're using that that background knowledge to help us make judgments. And that means that you can't just learn tricks to apply to a source. A source is never useful just in and of itself. It is dependent on how it relates to the inquiry that you're conducting and how it relates to the other sources you've got and the knowledge that you've accrued already about the topic that you're looking at. And then finally they agree that bias is problematic, and it seems to be increasingly questioned that there was a time when teachers would have asked students to spot bias and account for the bias, and now that's seen as a bit sloppy really, that it can lull children into a false sense of confidence that by spotting bias and then saying, so therefore this source isn't really trustworthy, you've dealt with source work. But of course the use of sources is much more nuanced than that. So the next key issue that emerges from this reading for me is that this idea that working with evidence can be challenging and motivating. It's not a hard slog, it's not difficult, and it's not boring. It can be interesting and motivating and really intriguing for children. But we need to be careful that we don't overdo it, that this is part of a mix, it's part of a balance. And if we overdo it, we can turn it into boring, repetitive classes, and we can also run the risk that we undermine children's sense of reliability, that they come to see that everything can be questioned and therefore they can't rely on anything they are told about history. So it's important to balance this out against all of the other skills, and that's another reason for saying this should be embedded in a whole inquiry, not parked in a place on its own in the curriculum. The next thing to say, and we haven't said much about this today because it comes later on in long session 5, but Phillips is pointing out that interpretations themselves can also function as sources for analysis. So when we're talking about all of the strategies I've suggested for working with evidence today, they can all be applied to working with historians' accounts of events and people or periods of time, as well as films of historical periods or documentaries or novels. These are all open to be analysed in various ways, and that's what the second half of Phillips' chapter is talking about, and that's a theme we'll return to in a couple of lectures' time. The seventh idea that emerges from these two articles is that there are some common features of source work that you can build into your routines. So the kinds of common things that you could be doing is setting children up to do comparisons between related sources. Instead of looking for bias, ask children to spot what the difference between fact and opinion, so that they're clear about the kinds of claims that are being made in sources, and they don't misinterpret opinions as being the same kinds of claims as facts. There's also a recurrent discussion about utility and purpose, and understanding that is as related to understanding your inquiry as it is to the source itself, and indeed to the provenance of the source. And finally, people are talking about the distinction between information and evidence, and there's that notion that when we move beyond just reading the source for comprehension to extract information, and we can get into inferring it and putting it in context and asking difficult questions of it, then we begin to use it as evidence. So these all seem to me useful terms and ideas that we could come back to recurrently and maybe put as part of our display on the wall. So these are kind of useful everyday bits of vocabulary in the history classroom. And then finally, building on this notion of vocabulary and key terminology, LeCocq draws our attention to the fact that some of the ways in which we then talk about this kind of analysis can be unfamiliar to especially young children at the beginning of secondary school. And so she suggests giving children some scaffolded sentences or some sentence starters so that they can express their reasoning about sources in nice, clear and concise ways. And I think that's always useful to think about. If this is an out of the ordinary way to deal with evidence, and it's a peculiar form of expression within a history inquiry, then it makes sense to set that up and have a conversation about that form of language with the children, so that they're, as she says, they don't fall at the last hurdle when it comes to reporting this in writing to you. So the last thing I want to do is just share this image from Dale Banham's work on King John, because this is referred to by Phillips, and this illustrates really nicely the theme about planning. So this is an overview of Dale Banham's entire scheme of work on King John. It doesn't matter that you may or may not know anything about King John. If we just follow through this sequence of activities, you can see hopefully that this is a way to make the whole scheme of work really accessible and clear to the children, but also it's a really useful way for mainstreaming this commitment to get children to think about evidence. So the unit 1.1 starts with the introduction to the life and crimes of King John, and outlines the traditional story of the bad King John. King John is famously the worst king in English history, or that's how history tends to judge him. So we're going to introduce children a bit of narrative history really here, just to sketch in the details. Straight into unit 1.2 then, which is questioning the evidence, examining where this negative interpretation of John originates from. Pupils are then encouraged to critically analyse the reliability of the contemporary sources on which John's bad reputation is based. And that builds on what Phillips was saying, is that really it comes down to one person who had a grudge against the king and a reason to try and write a negative history about him, and then the second source close to the reign is largely based on reinterpreting that first source, and then everything else seems to build from that. So we're introducing children to the idea that from this shared conclusion, if we track it back, we can get to a fairly narrow evidence base, and then we can start to think about how reliable is that particular evidence. Unit 1.3 is He Never Had a Chance, examines the responsibilities of a medieval monarch, investigates whether John had the right personal qualities for the job, and explores the problems that John inherited from his father and brother. And at the end of the unit, pupils write a report to John briefing the new king on the problems he's likely to face. That's about inserting some more information about the context. So pupils have learned a bit about John, they've learned a bit about how history has judged him, and now they're learning a bit about the nature of medieval monarchy and the kinds of challenges that John faced. So they can begin to understand what kind of issues the king confronted and what kinds of options were open to him. Then they move on to unit 1.4. Did John fail, or was he just unlucky? And it looks at the key events in John's reign. Pupils evaluate the way that John tackled the problems, and they write a speech criticising or defending his actions. So here we're not really dealing with evidence, we're just dealing with interpretation of particular events. So we're filling in some more background contextual information about John's reign. And then Unit 1.5 does something very different, and Dale Banham has labelled this as Danger High-Speed Historiography Hairpin, although I've just noticed how badly written that sign is, but that's what it should say, the High-Speed Historiography Hairpin. And in this unit, students are introduced to how other times, other periods of time, have judged John. So they come to this view that has John always been seen as a villain, or they come to the question rather, and they can come to the view that interpretations are constructed in particular times and they change over time. And then finally they pull this all together and they write an extended piece of work exploring why the reputation of King John has been problematic. But you can see in Unit 1.2 and in Unit 1.5 there's an explicit focus on evidence, but in between the teacher is inserting contextual information to prepare the students to become more critical and more nuanced in their use of that evidence. And then at the end there's an opportunity to pull this together. So I just share this with you because Phillips singled out as an example of really advanced pedagogy and someone who's really trying to pull together all the messages from research. And I think this illustrates how to do it in a really nice and accessible way, which is perfectly accessible and understandable by the children. The children really enjoy doing this scheme of work, but which leads to some really quite sophisticated handling of evidence and subsequent interpretations of evidence. So that's a recap of some of the key themes that emerge from the reading, and really which I think resonate hopefully with the core messages I was trying to communicate in the lecture. And at the end of that, I'm just going to ask you to do something fairly simple again for this week. It's just to pick one strategy in one of the readings or from the lecture where I've thrown in a couple of other activities. And then, if you can, pick something which you haven't used before in the classroom. Try it out in class. Just write an evaluation of how it went from your perspective as a teacher, trying out a new strategy and thinking about what you wanted to use that source or that activity for. And then think about how the children engage, look at their work, think about the questions they asked you, think about the answers they were able to give, think about the quality of their talk, and just reflect on whether this was useful in promoting, I suppose, well, really it comes down to whatever your learning intentions were, but it's useful to think about whether this helps them in promoting their understanding of and ability to use sources as evidence. And secondly, whether that helped them to move on in terms of their understanding of the period of history that they were studying. So that's it in a nutshell. I look forward as ever to reading your thoughts on the task in the online forum.